My child. There are moments in life that seem ordinary at first, yet they quietly become the beginning of a story that nobody forgets. Today is about one of those moments. Somewhere, someone special finally gathered the courage to speak openly with their family. For a long time, they had carried thoughts in silence, protecting them deep within their heart. Day after day, they wondered if the right moment would ever come. They questioned whether their words would be understood. They imagined countless outcomes, but no matter how much they thought about it, they could never predict what was actually about to happen. Stay with me, because this story unfolds in a way that very few people would ever expect. The evening felt different. Nothing unusual could be seen on the surface, yet there was a feeling in the air that something important was approaching. The family sat together, unaware that a conversation was about to change the atmosphere completely. The person at the center of this story looked around the room, taking in every face, every expression, every small detail. Their heart was racing, not because they were afraid of speaking, but because they knew that once the words were spoken, there would be no turning back. This was the moment they had waited for, and deep inside they felt that something significant was about to unfold. As they began to speak, the room became quieter than ever before. Every word seemed to carry meaning. Every sentence revealed a piece of what had been hidden for so long. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Everyone listened carefully. The person speaking could feel the attention in the room, and with every passing second, they became more confident. What started as a difficult conversation slowly transformed into something powerful. The walls of uncertainty that had existed for so long were beginning to fall away, and a new understanding was starting to take shape. But what happened next was the part nobody could have predicted. As the conversation continued, one family member suddenly reacted in a way that surprised everyone. It was not a dramatic reaction. It was not loud or emotional. It was something far more meaningful. A look of realization appeared on their face, as if they had just connected pieces of a puzzle they had been trying to understand for a very long time. The room remained silent, but the energy changed instantly. Everyone could feel it. Something important had just happened, even though no one had fully understood it yet. The person who had opened up noticed the change immediately. Questions filled their mind. Why did that expression seem so different? What realization had just occurred? Why did it suddenly feel as though the conversation had reached a turning point? The answers were still hidden, but they were closer than ever. And the more they listened, the more they realized that this story was becoming much bigger than they had imagined. What they thought would be a simple conversation was transforming into something that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. Then came a pause. A long pause. The kind of silence that makes every heartbeat feel louder. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. The person who had reacted earlier looked around the room before finally breaking the silence. Their words were calm. Their voice was steady. Yet the impact of what they said could be felt by everyone. In that moment, a truth began to emerge that had remained hidden for far longer than anyone realized. It was a truth connected to the very reason this conversation had happened in the first place. The atmosphere changed completely. Faces that once seemed uncertain now appeared thoughtful. Expressions that had been difficult to read suddenly carried new meaning. The person who had opened up could hardly believe what they were hearing. Piece by piece, a larger picture was forming. A story that had been incomplete for so long was finally beginning to make sense. And just when it seemed that everything had already been revealed, another unexpected detail came to light. That detail changed everything. It was not something anyone had planned to say. It was not something anyone expected to hear. Yet once it was spoken, the entire room understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for years. The person at the center of the story realized that what they had feared for so long had actually led them to something extraordinary. The courage to speak had opened a door that nobody knew existed. And the most remarkable part? The biggest revelation had not even arrived yet. Because as the conversation moved forward, another family member prepared to share something that had been kept private until this very moment. Something connected to the story in a way nobody could have imagined. Something that would explain why everything had happened exactly as it did. The room grew quiet once more. Every eye turned toward them. Every thought focused on what they were about to say. And at that exact moment, everyone realized that they were standing at the edge of a revelation that would change the entire story forever. A quiet realization was beginning to spread through the room. Nobody said a word at first, yet everyone could feel that the conversation had entered a completely different chapter. The family member who had been preparing to speak finally lifted their eyes and looked around. There was no hesitation anymore. There was no uncertainty. It was as though they had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. The person who had opened up earlier sat completely still, wondering what could possibly come next. Every second felt important. Every breath felt heavier than before. And then, at last, the silence was broken. The words that followed surprised everyone. Not because they were dramatic. Not because they were unexpected in a shocking way. But because they revealed something nobody had considered before. The family member explained that they had been observing things quietly for a long time. They had noticed small details that others overlooked. They had seen moments that seemed ordinary on the surface but carried deeper meaning underneath. Piece by piece, they had been putting together a picture that nobody else could see. And now, after hearing everything that had just been shared, they realized that all those pieces finally fit together. The room became even quieter. The person at the center of the story listened carefully. Their heart was racing. Questions filled their mind. What had been noticed? What had been understood? What was about to be revealed? The family member continued speaking, and with every sentence, the atmosphere changed. They described moments from the past that suddenly seemed important. They mentioned conversations that had appeared insignificant at the time but now carried entirely new meaning. One by one, memories resurfaced. Everyone in the room began connecting the dots. What once looked like random events now appeared to be part of a much larger story. Then came the statement that nobody expected. It was simple. It was calm. Yet it instantly changed everything. The family member explained that they had never doubted the sincerity behind what had just been shared. Deep down, they had always sensed that this day would eventually arrive. They had always believed there was something special unfolding beneath the surface, even when nobody talked about it openly. The person listening could hardly believe it. For so long, they had worried. For so long, they had wondered whether anyone would understand. Yet here was someone explaining that they had quietly understood far more than anyone realized. A feeling of relief filled the room. The tension that had existed earlier began to disappear. Smiles started appearing. The conversation became warmer. But the story was still not finished. In fact, another surprise was waiting. As everyone reflected on what had just been said, another family member leaned forward and began speaking. Their voice carried confidence. Their expression revealed certainty. It was clear that they wanted to add something important. Everyone listened closely. What they shared next caused several people in the room to exchange surprised glances. They explained that there had been private discussions before this day ever happened. Small conversations. Quiet observations. Moments when different family members had independently noticed the same thing. None of them had spoken openly about it until now, but many had reached remarkably similar conclusions. The person at the center of the story was stunned. How could this be possible? How could so many people have noticed something that they believed had remained hidden? The realization felt almost unbelievable. Yet as more details emerged, it became impossible to ignore. What seemed secret had not been invisible. What seemed unnoticed had actually been quietly understood. And suddenly, the entire conversation took on a completely new meaning. The room was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with clarity. People began sharing memories. They began recalling moments they had never discussed before. Each memory added another piece to the puzzle. Each story strengthened the connection between everything that had happened. The person listening realized something remarkable. The fear they carried had been far greater than reality itself. The understanding they hoped for had already existed. The acceptance they longed for had been closer than they ever imagined. And just when it seemed the most important revelations had already been shared, one final detail emerged. A detail that nobody saw coming. A detail connected to a conversation that had happened long before this day. A detail that explained why everything felt so meaningful. The family member paused before revealing it. Everyone waited. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. The anticipation was impossible to ignore. Then, slowly, they began explaining what had happened. And as the story unfolded, every person in the room realized they were witnessing something unforgettable. What they learned next would bring together every question, every doubt, and every mystery that had existed from the very beginning. And when that final piece was finally revealed, the entire story would make perfect sense. A forgotten memory was about to return. The room had already experienced surprise, understanding, and unexpected clarity. Yet nobody realized that the most meaningful part of the story was still waiting to be uncovered. The family member who had promised to explain everything took a slow breath before continuing. Their eyes reflected confidence, as though they finally understood why all of these events had unfolded exactly the way they had. Everyone listened. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. The person at the center of the story felt a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. So many unexpected truths had already surfaced, yet something deep inside told them there was still one missing piece. One final answer. One final revelation that would connect everything together. The family member began describing a day from the past. At first, the memory seemed ordinary. It was a simple moment. A simple conversation. A simple observation. Yet as they continued speaking, everyone realized that this memory was far more important than it first appeared. They explained how, long before today's conversation, they had noticed something unique. It wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't something obvious. It was a pattern. A quiet pattern that revealed itself through small actions, thoughtful words, and meaningful moments that most people would have overlooked. At the time, they didn't fully understand it. They simply remembered it. And now, after hearing everything that had been shared today, they finally understood why that memory had stayed with them for so long. The room grew completely silent. Every person present could feel that something important was approaching. The family member continued. They described how certain moments always seemed connected. Certain decisions always seemed to point in the same direction. Certain conversations always carried the same feeling beneath the surface. Looking back, it no longer felt random. Looking back, it felt like pieces of a story that had been forming quietly all along. The person listening could hardly believe what they were hearing. For years, they had viewed those moments separately. Now they were seeing them together. And everything looked different. Every memory suddenly carried new meaning. Every unanswered question suddenly seemed closer to being solved. Then came the realization that changed everything. The family member smiled and explained that the story everyone was discussing today did not truly begin today. It had started much earlier. Long before anyone openly spoke about it. Long before anyone acknowledged it. Long before anyone understood how important it would eventually become. The room filled with amazement. What seemed like a recent development was actually part of a much longer journey. What felt sudden had been quietly unfolding for a very long time. And that realization made the moment even more meaningful. The person at the center of the story felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Not because everything was perfect. Not because every answer had arrived instantly. But because they finally understood something powerful. The connections that mattered most had been growing quietly beneath the surface long before they became visible. The support they hoped for had existed longer than they realized. The understanding they searched for had been closer than they ever imagined. As these thoughts settled into everyone's hearts, another family member shared something unexpected. They admitted that they, too, had noticed signs long ago. At first, they ignored them. Then they became curious. Then they became convinced that one day a conversation exactly like this would happen. The room erupted with surprise. Not loud surprise. Not dramatic surprise. The kind of surprise that leaves people smiling because everything suddenly makes sense. One by one, family members began sharing similar experiences. Each story added another layer. Each memory added another connection. Each revelation strengthened the feeling that this moment had been destined to happen. What had started as a single conversation was now becoming something much greater. It was becoming a shared understanding. A shared realization. A shared celebration of honesty, courage, and connection. And then came the most beautiful moment of all. Someone quietly said that they were proud. Not because of the outcome. Not because of what had been revealed. But because someone had found the courage to be completely honest. The room fell silent once more. Those words carried enormous meaning. They were simple. Yet unforgettable. The person listening felt emotions they could hardly describe. For so long, they had worried about being understood. Now they realized they had been heard more deeply than they ever imagined. The conversation that once seemed impossible had become one of the most meaningful moments of their life. And yet, as everyone reflected on everything that had happened, one final question remained unanswered. A question nobody could ignore. A question connected to the future. Because understanding the past was only the beginning. What would happen next? What would this new understanding lead to? What possibilities had just been unlocked? The family exchanged thoughtful glances. They understood that today's revelations were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of a brand new chapter. A chapter filled with possibility. A chapter filled with hope. A chapter that nobody could fully predict. And as the conversation moved toward its next phase, everyone sensed the same thing. The biggest moment of all was still waiting just ahead.